Hi, everybody. This is Empowering Democracy. It's another Dump the Corruption show. And this is, we've been testing the Republican senators now. We tested the first 5 of the Republican senators on Wednesday. Tonight, we're testing the second 5 of the Republican senators, specifically J.D. Vance of Ohio, Lindsey Graham of South Carolina, John Thune of South Dakota, and we're being joined by my friend Dee Pierce, the host of Around the World with Dee and Friends.
Yes, I'm happy to be here.
And she'll be joining me, for the show tonight. So I was just naming the 5 we're going to take care of tonight. John Thune of South Dakota is the 3rd of the senators. He's a very important senator because he's the heir apparent to Mitch McConnell, as the leader of the Republicans in the Senate. If anything happens to Mitch, leadership will be going to John Thune, we believe. And then there is also Marsha Blackburn, of Tennessee. Mm-hmm. And the 5th of the senators we will be covering is the angelic Ted Cruz, as Dee informs us, also known as Eduardo Cruz.
Yes. He conveniently changes it to Ted, to sound different, not to sound as so ethnic, I guess, with Eduardo.
Well, to be fair, but Ted Kennedy also changed his name from Edward to Ted.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So there it is,
Mm-hmm.
So let's start examining and testing the Republican senatorial incumbents. Let's see what their fundraising patterns were. We're going to start with J.D. Vance, of Ohio. I'll share the screen to get his record from Open Secrets up. He ran for the Ohio Senate in 2022, and he also won. He ran against Tim Ryan. The fundraising figures are interesting. Tim Ryan raised $56.4 million for his campaign, spent $56.35 million, ended with $56,540. J.D. Vance, who was the winner, and this was an open seat, raised $15,233,000, spent $14,792,000, ended with cash on hand of $441,000. So J.D. Vance was outspent by almost 4 times in the direct campaign. So you wonder immediately what was going on. How did Tim Ryan lose with such a direct funding advantage in his campaign? Also, how did he lose when there was a bitter primary battle between J.D. Vance and Josh Mandel? There was a bitter primary battle about that, which we won't have the details on here. Anyway, when we look at the outside spending, we find that J.D. Vance there was $19,279,000 coming from PACs and carry committees and such in support of J.D. Vance, but $22 million in opposition to J.D. Vance. So, there was a net loss of almost $3 million there. But then we look at Tim Ryan, and the outside spending in support of Tim Ryan was close to $5 million.
Mm-hmm.
But he was opposed by $35 million. So he had a net loss of $30 million there to only $3 million for J.D. Vance. So J.D. Vance has a big advantage there, even if it's only on the negative side. Interestingly, the major competitor of J.D. Vance in a close race in the primary was actually Mandel, Josh Mandel. There was only $3,155,000 in support, of Mandel. Opposition to Mandel was roughly one half of that, 1,462,141. So his outside spending support was a net plus for him of $1.6 million roughly.
Mm-hmm.
So you wonder why he didn't do better, in the primary. But apart from that, even if we give the $30 million net loss, to J.D. Vance as if it were actually a contribution to his campaign,
Mm-hmm.
even if you view it as being as effective as all that, it still amounts to a situation where he was outspent by Tim Ryan by $56 million to $45 million.
Mm.
I'm talking in terms of equivalence. It's really not like that. It's if one takes away $30 million from Tim Ryan's total, he looks like he had a funding advantage of $20,405,000 to $15,233,000. You still wonder why Tim Ryan won. This was obviously a very negative campaign because both of the major candidates had a net loss in the outside spending. And Tim Ryan in particular, the Republicans mobilized. I mean, really, Tim Ryan is not that objectionable a candidate. But the Republican outside spending, I would have liked to have seen that up close and personal because it must have been incredibly negative. Anyway, let's go to the candidates page, see a little more of what was going on here. So Tim Ryan had 46.7% of the vote. And J.D. Vance had 53.3% of the vote. So J.D. Vance won. It wasn't all that close. It wasn't a slaughter of Tim Ryan, but it really wasn't all that close. We do find that in small individual contributions, that Tim Ryan had $22.7 million in small individual contributions, 40% of what he raised. In large individual contributions, Tim had 29,442,000. That was 52.2% of what he raised. And Tim's PAC contributions were 1.3 million, 2.29%. There was another category of nearly 3 million. In other words, in the other category, there was nearly $3 million that doesn't fit into any of the other categories. So you wonder where that came from.
Mm-hmm.
We've seen that in the number of races on the Republican side. It's like the disclosure they're giving is not really full disclosure, but anyway, J.D. Vance only raised $3.7 million from small contributions. That was 25% of what he raised, though, close to 25%. Large individual contributions, 5.2 million. PAC contributions, 793,000. The large individual contributions were 34.17% of what he raised. PAC contributions were 5.21%. As I said, 793,000. But there was candidate self-financing here of 700,000 that we have to add to the large individual contributions. But there's another category here of nearly $5 million. That's 31.42%, okay, of what we raised. And there's no indication of what category that is in. So that's a lot of money for us to be hidden from us in terms of knowing what happened in this particular campaign. Okay, let us now go to some of the other categories that can illuminate what happened. Among the industries, Tim Ryan got $8.3 million among retired people. $2.7 million from law firms, $1.7 million from education, $1.3 million from securities and investments, $1.1 million from health professionals, $1.015 million from real estate, from Democratic and liberal groups, $798,000, business services, $672,000, civil servants, public officials, $633,000, TV, movies, and music, $588,000, from leadership PACs, $523,000. So, lots of money coming from a variety of sources across the board. $227,000 from pro-Israel sources. J.D. Vance got $3.6 million from the retired category. That's a lot, but it's nowhere near Tim Ryan's $8.4 million from that category. Okay, am I sharing this?
Yes.
I am, okay. For a minute, I wondered if I was or was not. Okay, J.D. Vance, the only group that gave him over $1 million, okay, was the retired group, 3.7 million. Securities and investments, 656,000. Republican conservative, 588,000. Real estate, 557,000. The leadership PACs, 401,200. From pro-Israel groups, 167,000. Not as much as Tim Ryan in that respect. Across the board, from different categories, as we would expect from looking at the totals, much less than Tim Ryan got. Tim Ryan came into the race with a reputation as being heavily supported by labor. So we're going to be checking that out as we go down. Looking at the sectors now, J.D. Vance had important support from the construction sector, 325,000. From energy, natural resources, 401,000. From the fire sector, 1.6 million. For miscellaneous business, 754,000. Ideology, single issue groups, 1.3 million roughly, and the other category, 3.9 million roughly. So ideological single issue groups came in very strong for J.D. Vance. That was a major source of support for him, since he was considered a Trumpist and a far-right one at that. It isn't surprising that they came in so heavily for him in that category. So Tim Ryan got almost 1.7 million from communications electronics, 3.0 million or 4 million from the fire sector. Looking back at J.D. Vance's support from the fire sector, was much less at 1.6 million. Only a little over half what was given to Tim Ryan. Health sector, 1.8 million for Tim Ryan, only 450,000 for J.D. Vance. Labor gave Tim Ryan $495,404. Ideology single issue groups, 2.4 million for Tim Ryan. That pretty much doubles the amount that was raised in that category by J.D. Vance. In the other category for Tim Ryan, we had 11.4 million. And we don't know how to break that down. Okay, we don't know what happened in that category. So that's not really very illuminating for us. So let's go back up. Let's see what we can find out from outside spending. Maybe that will tell us the tale. I don't think there was enough spending by PACs in this race to give us some insight into why J.D. Vance won. We've seen these outside spending figures before, so I'm going to skip to the specific groups. There had to be, based on what went on, there had to be huge spending against Tim Ryan by red sector groups, because there's 35.3 million spent in opposition by red sector groups. Let's see who the big spenders were. We're seeing some in the hundreds of thousands there, but we're not seeing the real big spending that amounted to the 30 million against 35 million against Tim Ryan. The Buckeye Leadership Fund Super PAC spent nearly 3 million. We don't know how much of that was for J.D. Vance, Tim Ryan. There was 1 million from Buckeyes for a Strong Ohio. Those two super PACs are probably linked, so it's more like 4 million from the same sources. Club for Growth Action spent 8.2 million on this race. $4 million by how much of that was against Team Ryan and how much was for J.D. Vance. But it's a huge amount to spend. National Republican Senatorial Committee spent almost $2 million on this race. But you can be pretty sure it wasn't for Tim Ryan. Ohio Leads PAC, 4 million. Again, we don't know how much was against Tim Ryan and how much was for J.D. Vance. The Pennsylvania Lawyer Fund, the Super PAC, spent $500,000 on this race. Usually they're neither red nor blue. We don't know if they came in for Tim Ryan or for J.D. Vance. Whoa. Project Ohio Values PAC, a carry committee that's very much like a super PAC, spent almost $16 million either against Tim Ryan or for J.D. Vance. That's a huge amount of money from one group, even if we're talking a Senate race. The Republican Party of Shelby County, Ohio, spent $1.4 million. Again, either for J.D. Vance or against Tim Ryan, we don't know. The Senate Leadership Fund, Republican group, spent $32.5 million either for J.D. Vance or against Tim Ryan. Again, we don't know. But that was just a huge amount to spend. I'm going past some of the minor contributions, and when I say minor, I mean when people are coming in with this scale of funding, even $500,000 contributions, okay, are minor. The USA Freedom Fund Super PAC came in with $5.5 million. They're a Republican Super PAC. The Working America Party, well, I'm going to mention them anyway, even though their $464,980 is not very significant with all the money being thrown around in this race. But they're a 501c4. They probably supported Tim Ryan all the way. So I suppose that's the story. Republican super PACs threw so much in ad money into this race. It made up for the direct funding advantage. Still very surprising. I feel compelled to say that there has to be an ideological factor here where the alignment with Donald Trump and the right wing of the Republican Party was so heavy in certain circles that the money spent did not matter so much. That they were so much in favor of J.D. Vance from the get-go that no amount of counter-spending could give the advantage to Tim Ryan. I have to admit, I don't understand why Tim Ryan was so hated by the Republicans. Here he is, a centrist Democrat, but from the House, on the right wing of the Democratic Party. He's running for the Senate. He was not liked by progressives, okay, at all. But at the same time, that would not throw them across to J.D. Vance. So what caused this? It's just not clear. Off the financials, looks like Tim Ryan should have won going away. But that wasn't what happened.
Who knows?
The ideological factor must have been very important in this race.
It had to be.
Yeah, going beyond the power of the spending. Well, here's Lindsey Graham. Jesus. This was the other race by the Democrats that I was hinting at just yesterday. I said I forgot about a particular race. This was this one, the Lindsey Graham race. Lindsey was the winner. He raised 109 million, spent 97 million, came out with 12.5 million left in cash on hand. He was being opposed by Jamie Harrison, who was a candidate who had particularly won the favor of Chuck Schumer. Schumer marshaled $130.54 million in favor of Jamie Harrison. Jamie Harrison spent $130 million, left with only $335,000 at the end of the campaign. And yet, you'll see what a big margin there was for Lindsey Graham in this campaign. This was another case where a centrist Democrat, even with a lot of money behind him, such as Sarah Gideon in Maine, Amy McGrath in Kentucky, and Jamie Harrison in South Carolina, could not win from a right-wing Republican, even though they vastly outspent him. They wouldn't let a progressive win, in the primaries. They spent a fortune. Well, you saw, on Amy McGrath, they spent about $90 million. On Jamie Harrison, they spent $130.5 million. That's $220.5 million. And we haven't hit yet the third of these big spending races. Well, Ohio is pretty big spending too, but I'm not even going to mention Ohio. What I'm really interested in is the main race, which we won't get to until next time, until next week. But in these first two big spending races, the Democrats spent on two Senate races $220.5 million roughly. And they couldn't win. And Lindsey Graham can't be the most attractive Republican candidate in the world because he just comes off as such a slimeball, such an unattractive candidate. I mean, you wonder how he wins it all. He must win it all because the centrist candidate opposing him, in this case Jamie Harrison, just doesn't excite at all. Here's another area where outside spending was important and was probably horribly negative against Jamie Harrison. We see here $4.2 million in support of Jamie Harrison from the outside spending, but $26.3 million in opposition, a net loss of $22 million, whereas Lindsey Graham had $7.4 million in support, $13.3 million in opposition, nearly $6 million in a net loss. So in other words, even though Lindsey Graham had nearly a $6 million net loss in outside spending, he still won over Jamie Harrison, who had a net loss of $22 million in outside spending. How can you have people who hate you so much that there's going to be a net loss of $22 million in outside spending? And in the Ohio race we just saw, it was a net loss for Tim Ryan of $30 million. I mean, how do you get hated that much by the opposition? I don't know. I really don't. I'm going to take a quick look at the outside spending specifically at this point, even before I go to the candidates page. I just want to see where the big money came in. because the outside spending is where the super PACs and the carry committees come in. Okay, the AFSCME 501c4 group gave 1.3 million to, I'm sure, Jamie Harrison. The Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee gave 812,000 to Jamie Harrison. They must have given him a lot more money in direct campaign support. The LCV Victory Fund Super PAC gave $1.9 million, actually closer to $2 million, to Jamie Harrison. And Liberty, South Carolina, which is a Democratic group, Super PAC, gave 1.1 million to Jamie Harrison. The LMG PAC, another Democratic Super PAC, gave 1.4 million to Jamie Harrison. We're going by the small contributions. The National Republican Senatorial Committee gave 788,000 in support of Lindsey Graham. NRA Victory Fund 309,000 in support of Lindsey Graham. 1.3 million from the Opportunity Matters Fund. They presumably are the for Lindsey Graham or against Jamie Harrison. The Security Strength Group, $13.7 million. Either against Jamie Harrison or for Lindsey Graham. The Senate Leadership Fund, $16.6 million. Either for Lindsey Graham or against Jamie Harrison. The Senate Majority PAC, nearly $5 million for Jamie Harrison. $2.5 million from the Lincoln Project. That's considered a Democratic super PAC, but its donors are mostly Republicans. They gave $2.5 million to Jamie Harrison in outside spend. They supported most probably Jamie Harrison. Or maybe they were doing very negative ads on Lindsey Graham. And that covers it. Okay, it doesn't seem like it really covers all the outside spending that was supposed to have taken place. Though we saw in just these two figures, we saw almost 14 million from the Security Strength PAC and 16 million from the Senate Leadership Fund Super PAC. So that's 29 million right there. But it's also true that if we go back to the beginning, we see that there was a total of more than 39 million. Well, let's see, this is better. Over $51 million was spent by the carry committees and super PACs was spent, okay, in this race. It didn't look like all the individual contributions totaled up to 51 million, did it, Dee?
No.
Looks like there are some missing contributions here.
It's interesting how they put things together. They just kind of shield themselves as much as they possibly can.
So you can't really tell exactly what's going on. Yeah.
Right.
Still, obviously, the outside spending made a big difference in this race. And the fact that there was such a net negative in outside spending for Jamie Harrison. We know those outside spending ads are very negative ads.
Yes.
So that's as far as I'm going to go with this particular race. For me, the most outstanding part of it is that, okay, the Democrats spent $130 million to try to win this particular seat, okay, for the Senate, and $90 million trying to win the seat in Kentucky. That's $220 million on 2 seats. It's an average of $110 million per seat. And they were in South Carolina and Kentucky. Weren't in California, weren't in New York, weren't in Texas, okay, in the real big states. They were in relatively small-sized states. Anyway, let us move on. Time's a wasting here. We have John Thune running in a very red state with no big challenge from Brian Bangs, Democrat. But I have to say, when you talk about South Dakota and North Dakota, there were Democratic senators in both states in the not so distant past. So why is this state suddenly so red that a Democratic candidate running against John Thune can only raise $495,000? That's really amazing when you think about it.
Mm-hmm.
So $13 million was raised by John Thune. He spent nearly $6.8 million. Ended with cash on hand of $17 million. That's more than twice of what he spent on this campaign, saved for his next campaign. Of course, we'll find he slaughtered the guy. There was some outside spending, $107,000 in support of Thune, $1,475 opposing Thune. This was really no contest. I'm sorry, my voice is starting to fail me a bit.
Mm-hmm. I was gonna say blessings.
I got some tea. I'm okay.
Okay.
There, with the tea. So this is one where outside spending, super PAC spending, had no effect because this was no contest. Thune got 69.6% of the vote. And Brian Beng's got 26.2% of the vote. I have to say, not bad if you've only got 500,000. Maybe the Democrats should have run somebody stronger and put some money in on this race. I don't know. South Dakota looks very, very red right now. Small individual contributions from Thune to Thune's campaign, a little over $1 million, 7.89% of what he raised. Large individual contributions, 5.5% of what he raised. PAC contributions, 4.2% of what he raised. I'm sorry, $4.2 million, 32.47% of what he raised. So there it is, the pattern, the large individual contributions, the PAC contributions, meaning that there's a fail of the litmus test. And by the way, in the Lindsey Graham race, I really didn't cover that in the Lindsey Graham race, but it was clear in both of those races that both candidates, well, let's go back and check just briefly. It won't take but a minute. In the South Carolina race, I got so excited by the outside spending in this race, I didn't check the basics. There's, no, I can't believe this. Okay, so Lindsey Graham got small individual contributions, 51,550,832. That was 47.33% of what he raised.
Mm-hmm.
Now, he flunks the litmus test because his large individual contributions were even greater, 54,431,894. And the PAC contributions were 2.9 million, which are appreciable, though they're only 2.66% of the total. But we saw in the outside spending that there was a big advantage for Lindsey Graham, in that. So Lindsey Graham fails, the litmus test. Jamie Harrison also failed it, though. His small individual contributions were 54.28%, $70,858,482. He actually had more in small individual contributions than in large individual contributions. But he fails the litmus test because of the outside spending, because of large individual contributions, still 60,250,924, and then the PAC contributions of $725,929. So he did fail, the litmus test. Also, when we take into account the super PACs, the fact that he did get a lot of super PAC money, even though it was not nearly as much as the opposition to him. So looking at the history for the Ohio Senate race, the J.D. Vance Senate race, we've got, for Tim Ryan, small individual contributions of $22.7 million, 40.25% of what he raised. Large individual contributions, $29.4 million, 52.2% of what he raised. PAC contributions, $1.3 million, 2.29% of what he raised. So, both on grounds of the PAC contributions and the large individual contributions, he fails the litmus test. And also, he did get a considerable amount of PAC funding that he failed to repudiate. So he fails, okay, the litmus test also. But J.D. Vance fails it too. He had much less in small individual contributions, 3.7 million, 24.6% of what he raised. He raised more in large individual contributions, 34.17%. And the PAC contributions were appreciable at 793,473, and he got all of that outside spending support. So you have to include that too. And that's why he fails, okay, the litmus test. So both J.D. Vance and John Thune failed, okay, the litmus test. And as we saw, Lindsey Graham also failed, okay, the litmus test. So we have 3 of the 5 Republicans failing the litmus test so far. When we move to Tennessee, and I should share that. When we move to Tennessee, there is Marsha Blackburn. You can almost imagine her as the queen of the prom or something like that.
No.
But she is so nasty. Anyway, she was running against one Phil Bredesen. He did get 43.9% of the vote. He raised $19.4 million, spent $19.2 million, ended with $159,996. And Marsha Blackburn raised $14.4 million, spent $16.3 million, still came out, spent more than she raised, but still came out with $614,000 cash on hand. So it was closer than she wanted at 54.7 to 43.9. Outside spending, there was 9.9 for Marsha Blackburn, 17, almost 10 million, let's say, 17.5 million in opposition to Marsha Blackburn. So there was a net loss of 7.5, 7.6 million there. But Phil Bredesen got supported by 6.5 million. But he was also opposed by 20 million. So there was a net loss of roughly 14 million there. So there was a big advantage for Marsha Blackburn in the outside spending category, which made up for the disadvantage she had in the direct spending category, where Phil Bredesen had roughly a $5 million advantage. In dollars spent also, we should note Phil Bredesen spent more, okay, than Marsha Blackburn by roughly $3 million. But the greater net loss of Phil Bredesen, the outside spending, seems to have put the incumbent, okay, who is Marsha Blackburn, in reasonably good shape. Let's look at the candidates page again, see if we can learn anything more from that. Small individual contributions, 8.9% for Marsha Blackburn. No, for Phil Bredesen. 43.7% in large individual contributions. PAC contributions, 608,760. That's substantial, but it only amounted to 3.13% of what he raised. Phil Bredesen was rich. He self-financed to the tune of $7.5 million, 39%. If we add those to his large individual contributions, he had large individual contributions of $16 million all told. So, of course, on those grounds alone, but also on grounds of the super PAC figures, he fails. Okay, the litmus test. Marsha Blackburn, the winner at 54.7%, also fails. Okay, the litmus test because her small individual contributions are 1.567 million, 10.88% of what she raised. Large individual contributions, 8.2 million, 56.9% of what she raised. PAC contributions, 2.6 million, 18% of what she raised. There's this other category there, the troubling one again, $2 million, that for some reason doesn't fit in the other seemingly mutually exclusive categories. No candidate self-financing for her, but it seems to be another case where a centrist Democrat who's pretty well off got run by the Democrats. A fair amount of money was spent, but the centrist Democrat lost to a Republican in a very red state. Even though the centrist Democrat outspent, the Republican. We've been seeing races tonight. In all the races, except for the South Dakota race with John Thune, seemed like the Democrats were outspending the Republicans by healthy amounts. And they still got beat. I got to attribute this to Chuck Schumer, who loves to put up these centrist candidates, some of whom have their own money. But people don't see them as different enough from the Republican candidates who are running against them for them to win. They're just too much alike, the Republicans. They can't get a lot of enthusiasm behind them. And they lose. And a lot of that, you can see from the financial patterns, they're getting their money from the same groups where the Republicans are getting their money. Mm-hmm. Generally speaking, in other words, the upper crust in society, the well-off, and they're failing because people don't see them as offering something better.
Yeah, and the Democrats too lost a lot of labor when it comes to unions, especially when they shipped all those jobs overseas.
Yeah, Bill Clinton did an awful lot to undermine labor support for the Democratic Party. And it certainly shows. So Phil Bredesen got $1.2 million from lawyers and law firms, about $1 million from the retired groups, $600,000 from securities and investments, $457,000, from real estate. He just doesn't look real different in his pattern of fundraising from someone who's like, okay, Marsha Blackburn. Here's Marsha now. 1.5 million from the retired groups. She actually raised more money than he did from the retired groups. 1 million as well from the Republican conservative groups. The other figures were fairly similar to Phil Bredesen. He had a small fundraising advantage. He didn't run as a different looking candidate. And I got to think that's why he lost. As we saw, though, both candidates failed. Okay, the litmus test. These are the sector totals. For some reason, Marsha Blackburn's popular with the communications electronics crowd. She raised $706,000. Fire sector gave her almost $2 million. Oh, I'm sorry. I may have misspoke there. Let me get to the fire sector again. Yeah, almost $2 million. The ideology single issue sector gave her almost $2 million. She's pretty right wing as a Republican. Okay, she's not part of the, this really crazy right wing crowd. She's just solid right wing of the Republican Party. So Phil Bredesen also got a lot of money from communications electronics. Also a lot of money from the fire sector, 1.5 million. From labor, only $140,000. In ideology single issue groups, 1.1 million. Is that really different from Marsha Blackburn? Somewhat different, 1.9 versus 1.1 in ideology single issue groups. So I think what happened in this particular election had to do with it's a very red state. It's hard to challenge a Republican in red state, but Tennessee these days. There was a lot of outside spending in these races. Altogether, just spent on Bredesen and Blackburn alone, there was $54 million in outside spending. And we saw that Blackburn had a big advantage there. So I'd say the outside spending put her over the top. Tennessee being a really red state also put her over the top. And the fact that Phil Bredesen wasn't exactly a flaming progressive as well, didn't offer much of a choice to the incumbent. As we saw, both candidates were supported by the well-off, had substantial PAC support, and a lot of outside spending money, a lot of support in those categories too, though both had a net loss in those categories. But still, candidates are not repudiating the spending of the carry committees and the super PACs. they're a factor in these particular elections. Marsha Blackburn then also fails, the litmus test. And we're now down to Ted Cruz, who is our last, a 10th Republican to be tested. He had an interesting race because he was nearly beaten by Beto O'Rourke. He was the winner. He raised $45.3 million to Beto's, spent $45.6 million, came out with cash on hand of $157,959. So Beto raised and spent far more than Ted Cruz. Almost $80 million spent by Beto. $79.1 million. Almost $80 million raised by Beto. $79.1 million spent by Beto, who emerged from the race with $286,531. Two Libertarian candidates, specifically Neil Dykman and Phil Gray, got very little of the vote, less than 1%. So in the outside spending, Beto was supported by $1.7 million in outside spending and opposed by $8.0 million. So Beto was like a negative $6.3 million there. Ted Cruz supported by $1.2 million, opposed by $3.2 million. So he had a net loss of $2 million there. So net loss of $2 million is not as bad as a net loss of, $6.3 million, something like that. So Ted Cruz in the outside spending category made up for the spending advantage, of Beto. It's hard to see how Beto lost spending so much more than Ted Cruz.
Beto had the media role with him too. He used to how big the media was with Beto O'Rourke.
The national media, not necessarily the Texas media.
That's true.
But the national media, and certainly Fox was for Ted Cruz. They weren't for Beto. But $35 more million was spent, by Beto. Even taking into account the outside spending, he still had a $30 million spending advantage over Ted Cruz.
Okay.
So why didn't he win? That's an interesting question, but let's look at the determining factor for the litmus test. Small individual contributions for Ted Cruz, 31.23%, but large individual contributions, 19.4 million. PAC contributions, 1.6 million. That was enough to fail, the litmus test. There was some self-financing, only $10,000 from Ted Cruz for this campaign. In the other category, there was $10,139,054. Again, where can that possibly fit? Remember, this is not outside spending, so it's not super PACs. So there are small individual contributions, there are large individual contributions, there are PAC contributions. What's in that other category? How does it break down? We don't know. So the way Open Secrets is looking at the spending, it's just not getting deep enough into what is happening there. Beto also failed to take the litmus test. He did great in small individual contributions. He had a better ground game than Ted Cruz, at least in raising money. 47% of his contributions were small individual contributions. He didn't have much in PAC money, 83,441. But of course, he had substantial super PAC money, even though it was a net loss. And he had large individual contributions of $43 million, 54.72%. So he fails, the litmus test too, as does Ted Cruz. So all five of the office holders right now failed in their litmus tests. Ted Cruz bit of the dust, as well. Let's see what the outside spending says here, if it gives us any more insight into what happened. Club for Growth Action spent $1.2 million. Actually, they had a PAC and a super PAC do some outside spending. So they still come to $1.2 million in spent. I'm looking at the big numbers here in the super PAC spending. Ending Spending Action Fund Super PAC, $1.7 million. They're a red super PAC. So they were either for Cruz or they were against what Beto was standing for.
Well, I was thinking too, with people voting, and they went out and voted, and I guess being Texas, maybe there was a lot more Republicans out. Or maybe
Well,
more Republicans voted for the other candidate. Some people could have just voted for president, then you have other people that went the whole R down.
I don't think Texas is that red anymore. In other words, there was a lot of voter suppression
Mm-hmm.
in Texas. So gerrymandering is not a factor here because it's a statewide election. But at the same time, if this was anything like the 2020 election, most likely the Republicans were successful in suppressing a lot of the black vote and maybe a lot of the Hispanic vote that would otherwise have gone, to Beto.
Mm-hmm. That's true.
So maybe that was the big factor here.
I would think it would be, because we've
Voter
seen it
suppression.
in other places, that the suppression, they have the long waiting, the lines that are so long, and they just make it so difficult.
Oh, yeah, they were just shutting down the black the polling, not so much the black polling places, but the Hispanic polling places. But during a Democratic primary in 2020, they were just shutting those down like
Mm-hmm.
crazy in order to knock down Bernie's vote in Texas. I mean, that was going on. I'm still trying to find where there was big outside spending. The Progressive Turnout Project did 611,000. That was probably for Beto. Actually, almost 612,000. That's a fairly big figure when I scroll down here. There was Texans are PAC, Super PAC, 5.152 million dollars in spending, either for Ted Cruz or against Beto. So that was big. Then there's Texas Forever. That was big for Beto, $2.3 million. So Beto came close to winning. This time, Sema Hernandez was on his side and was trying to turn out the Hispanic vote for him in Texas. Okay, this is once again when you look at the outside groups spending money in this race, their figures, there doesn't seem to be enough to account for the outside spending totals. Seems like there are a lot of contributions, big contributions missing here. Because in total outside spending, here there was $14 million. And when we look at these numbers down here, it doesn't look like it's $14 million. In spite of the $5 million contribution from one entity. Yeah, 5.152 from the Texans are PAC. So it looks more like, if we look at the other figures down here, it looks more like it's $10 million than $14 million. Anyway, both candidates fail. Okay, the litmus test, that is the bottom line here. Texas, of course, is still a red state, but Beto came close, showing that Cruz is not very popular. That was also indicated, I think, by when we look at the candidates page. If we look at the small dollar donations for Beto, they are pretty damn high at $37 million. So his ground game was much better. Anyway, they both failed, okay, the litmus test. So that makes 10 Republicans who have failed it thus far. Next week we will do the final 5. We'll do that on Tuesday, and then on Friday we'll have an analysis of what we learned by administering the litmus tests to so many congressional candidates and 30 of the senatorial candidates. I think you can see the lessons, kind of emerging out of all the detail that we've been through. I still feel, though, that I don't have much I don't see the patterns in the super PAC spending very much. So Robert says, small group tonight, I guess they're listening in what's going on in Russia today. Why, is there something special going on RT? Robert Copeland says that Lindsey Graham wants the United States to go to war against other countries, including uh, uh, China. I think the Democrats had an excellent chance to beat up on Lindsey Graham this year if they had run a progressive in South Carolina and they managed to give the progressive $50 million. They would have saved, then on that race, they would have had a saving of $80 million to spend elsewhere. Because it wasn't, well, we didn't see, did we see? Of course, things weren't that close in South Carolina. I believe Lindsey Graham, if I recall correctly, still won by 60-40. But I think a progressive candidate there would have done a lot better than Jamie Harrison. And the Democrats could have saved themselves a large portion of that $130 million. That was ridiculous. Also ridiculous in Kentucky, where Mitch romped, easily defeating Amy McGrath. And she spent the 80 or the $85 million. I forget how much it was. It was all nonsense. Robert Copeland says a lot of labor unions are supporting President Biden and VP Kamala Harris. Yeah, Robert, it's only their leaders who are supporting Biden and Harris. The rank and file did not endorse, have a vote over who to endorse. I'm quite sure that the endorsement of the leaders of the labor unions doesn't mean anything from the standpoint of what the real popularity of Joe Biden is going to be. I think right now it just looks like he is going to be a big loser.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, anything more to say, Dee?
I think you covered a lot.
Oh, you think I did?
Yeah, I thought you did very well. There's just so much stuff. And then there's a lot of questionable.
Yes.
The questionable stuff, the hidden.
Yeah, it's hard to get through the hidden stuff. When it's so high, when it's $5 million, $6 million, maybe $10 million in one of these campaigns, it's very hard to see what is going on.
Because they don't want you to see.
Well, we do see, though,
You see enough.
they're all failing the litmus test.
Mm-hmm.
We might not know why certain victories have occurred. I think it's not always, all about the financing. It's important that I think it's just important that in many of these red states, you have the Democrats putting up centrist candidates and spending a fortune on them. And then we're losing anyway. In the final five, I'm going to include Susan Collins in her race in 2022, where she was running against Sarah Gideon, who ran a very centrist campaign. Sarah Gideon was the Speaker of the House, in Maine. But she ran a campaign which was very centrist. She could have run a more progressive campaign, but she chose not to. She got this enormous amount of money from the Democrats. And she lost anyway. We're going to see that. I forget how much money was spent on that race, but I think it was very close to the amount of money the Democrats spent on the Amy McGrath race. That was ridiculous. Spending $80 million on a centrist who sounded like she would support Trump in many instances. I mean, what kind of insanity was that? Chuck Schumer, just insane. So, Robert Copeland informs us there might be a coup with the Russian army attacking the Wagner Group by Rostov-on-the-Don. I wasn't talking about the Russia Today network, but what was happening in Russia. Thanks. Why would the Russian army be attacking the Wagner Group? That's amazing.
Why don't you Google? Because that's what I'm doing right now to try to figure out what the heck. Yeah, Richard Medhurst is live with it, but reading from somewhere, I don't know.
Is Richard Medhurst live about that?
Yes.
Is there anybody with him?
He's got a question mark, so I don't know if he is, if it's really something, or because I know MSNBC is talking about it. So you have USA media, then you know that's something I don't listen to. They usually make up stuff, so I'm trying to see.
They make up stuff, yeah.
Here's Putin is trending on Twitter. 59 minutes ago. Breaking. An hour ago. Oh no, see, I don't know. We don't know. It has here Jackson Hinkle is saying Prigozhin just took over the Kremlin and is preparing a public execution for Putin after invading Russia with 5 pickup trucks. So you could be joking about it. So I don't know. Oh, Ukraine supporters. Okay. So we don't know. We don't know because we don't, you know. Okay, this is a source saying Russian media source. The source says there is panic in the Kremlin. No one can reach Putin. Source, right now the Kremlin is negotiating about something with General Governor Diamond. Source, some people in the Kremlin from the presidential administration are finding out about a possible emergency relocation. One of the few available destinations in Uruguay. So I don't know. Then you have that Biden has been briefed about what is happening in Russia with armored vehicles. So, like, you don't know. We don't know.
We do not know. Huh?
Okay, if you go into Putin, he's trending. So you go into Twitter. "13 minutes ago, somebody posted, Wagner PMC has liberated Rostov-on-Don from Putin's regime population."
So Prigozhin turned against Putin, who probably tried to discipline him because he was going against the regular army.
Mm-hmm.
That it seems clear it's something like that. Okay, that's going on. Okay.
Okay.
So let us say good night for now.
Yes.
And we'll find out what is going on.
Right, and I'll be on tomorrow night, so we'll talk about it tomorrow night, I guess.
Okay.
After we get educated on it.
Yeah. Okay, thanks for coming. Thanks for helping out.
Yes, and please hit the like button, subscribe, and share.
Yes, and buy us a cup of coffee, please.
Yes.
Buy us both cups of coffee, or cups of tea, or beers, or whatever.
Exactly. I guess that's it. And I will say good night, and good night to Bonnie as well.
Good night.
Good night. Bonnie's passing by, I see.
Yes. Okay, thanks again, Dee.
Oh, you're welcome. And thank you. Good night.
Bye.